Welcome back, I'm EG, and it is time for me to be the language nerd that I am. Welcome to my conlanging series. This series is going to be Conlanging 101. We are going to go start to finish inventing a language. I'm really excited. Alrighty. Well, I guess we'll just get started. Fiction, in this case, especially science fiction and fantasy, are basically reflections of all of the options and diversities and possibilities that our world has to offer. There are as many things as are in the universe that you can manipulate and make and talk about, magic and people and situations, and the result is an incredibly stunning array of fiction pieces that are really good at telling stories. However, when you interact with so many different stories, it can be a little bit easy, perhaps too easy, to forget the fact that language plays a huge, huge role in society, in culture, in situations, and that's kind of sad. Language is something that makes up thought. Thought makes up language. Language is an inherent part of any culture. It is an incredibly complex and stunning thing. There are so many languages out there. I mean, thousands of languages out there. And so that can also be reflected in your fiction piece. Having a conlang, a constructed language, in your work can make things feel more realistic. It can add an extra dimension to flesh out situations or characters or whatever. And honestly, for people like me, it's just great fun. I mean, you've got things like Klingon or the Elvish languages, Quenya and Sindarin. I've got things like Dothraki. The language possibilities out there are astonishing. And those are the ones that just appear in fiction. People have been doing conlangs just for the sake of doing conlangs for a long time. Now, I'm going to be specifically addressing the use of conlangs in fiction, but to do that, I have to go through and explain how to do conlanging. That means we're going to be going through the art of language invention as well as the actual linguistic science piece. And now, if you have any questions, send me a message. I promise I will address as many questions as I get. I am here to help. Linguistics is my field of expertise, and conlanging is one of my favorite things. So if you have any questions, do let me know, but do know that we are going to be going start to finish, inventing a language, the process, how to do that. We're actually going to be going through and talking about the language that is in Speaker of Words. We're going to be talking about how I invented Eloiac. So that's going to be great fun. And I hope you enjoy it. Now, do be aware this is going to get a little bit technical at points. I shall do my very best to go through and talk about each technical piece so that you understand. However, if you have any other questions, I will also leave links in the description box below for more resources or ways to get in touch with me so I can explain things further. Now, without further ado, let's get started talking about languages in general. Language doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is something that exists in the context of a culture, of a situation, of a people, of a world, per se. It doesn't exist on its own. If the language you find, like in Speaker of Words, Eloiac is an ancient language, but it also exists in the context. The context in Speaker of Words is different than the original context for the ancient language, but it definitely exists as a context. Now, For the invention of a language, you can have many different, different influences, or you can have none at all. It is likely that you speak a language. If you are listening to this, it's likely that you speak English. You may have been influenced by other languages that you have learned. You may know Spanish or French or Chinese or whatever and be able to do that. And so you have therefore been influenced by that language and have that in your repertoire. Now, do know that basing a conlang off of a language is okay. It's perfectly fine to use languages that have influenced you and that you know to create a conlang. I, for one, Eloiach is based off of Semitic languages, Germanic languages, and Cyrillic languages. In the structure of the syntax, in the phonetics and the phonology, even in some of the pragmatics. It's very much a combination of those three, and yet it is a unique entity on its own. It is also possible, although much more difficult, to create a language that is not necessarily based on any natural language that we speak in the world today. Chances are, though, that there are going to be similar features to natural languages simply because we have to be able to speak them. And therefore there are only, a limited number of sounds that humans can produce. The structure of a sentence has to contain certain things, although not necessarily. But anyways, it's a much more difficult process to create a language that is not based on or influenced by languages that already exist. So just be aware. In the use of an influencing language, you can use what pieces you want. You can sort of pick and choose, certain sounds or structures or meanings or whatever. Like for me, for example, Eloiach is a compounding language. I can take words like sek, which is no, and ren, which is yes, and I can combine them into sek na ren, which is maybe but probably not, or ren na sek, which is maybe but probably yes. And those are then compounded and give different meanings to things. So that is very much picked up from German, but I don't use all of the aspects of German in my language. I don't have articles that change case necessarily. However, if you use too much of a language, if you basically take your language and make it a German look-alike, accepting that you changed the spelling of a few words, that can be problematic. You want to be sure to avoid cultural appropriation and appropriation of languages because there are certain ideas and stereotypes that are associated with those languages, and that can be problematic if you are, I guess, manipulating those stereotypes for your own purposes. As long as you acknowledge the influences on your conlang, and as long as you are respectful to the languages that you are borrowing from and to the people to whom those languages belong, you shouldn't have a problem. But just be aware that if you use too much of a language or you associate certain stereotypes with certain languages, that can be problematic. Generally speaking, though, borrowing from languages as influence, not really a problem. Let's start and go into thinking about how you want your language to function, what you want it to sound like, what you want it to represent. You have to then, first off, think of your language in its appropriate context. For me, the context was a dead language that was in a sci-fi novel in a very technologically advanced world that was having certain problems. So, okay, that's the context of my language, but let's look at the original context of my language also, because it is technically a dead language. I have to look at the people who spoke it originally, the Eloi or wanderers, what their values were, what they believed, their culture as a people. That is absolutely intertwined with the language. You can think of some certain characteristics that you want your language to have, or you want the people who speak that language to have. Make a list. So for me, I have a few different things. Like, I happen to be fond of sharper consonants and fricatives and things that are a bit bold in my sounds. So that's something I want in my language, and I'll be using certain sounds to achieve that goal. Then I also want the language to be able to demonstrate that the people who speak it, or spoke it in this instance, were curious. They wandered around and quested and sought out information, so they were very much seeking. So that has to be something that my language reflects. And then I also wanted that compounding piece because I thought, honestly, it's just really cool. There, of course, will be limitations to that, but I like the idea that it can be compounded, that you can build one idea off of another to create something new that goes very much in line with the culture of the Eloi. So make this list. Give 3 or 4 different characteristics that you want, and we will get into the details of actually creating this language next time. Let me give you a little bit of the layout of how this series is going to go. We are going to start from the small pieces to the large pieces. And in linguistics, the smallest pieces are the sounds. So we're going to start with the sounds, the phonetics. We're going to move into words, which is the next unit up, which is lexicon. We're going to move then into the structure, syntax or grammar. We're going to then look at the meanings of things, which is semantics. And then we're going to get into the actual usage of language, which is pragmatics. So I will be going through each of those and talking about the scientific pieces that you need to build a language, and then how to actually incorporate that in using Eloiac as an example. The final video of the series will then be talking about other details involved in the conlanging process when you're trying to incorporate it into writing or screenplay or whatever form. So I'm going to be talking about how to use it in writing, how frequently you need it, the sort of transliteration process. I'm going to be talking about different dialects. I'm going to be talking about how languages evolve over time, if you want to talk about that, how languages are related to each other. I'm going to be talking about how to create a writing system for your language as well, although that's kind of going to be done throughout, since most of the conlangs will have, or at least Eloiac has its own alphabet. So we'll go from there. If you have any questions, do not hesitate to ask. Please ask. Send me any questions you've got. I will do my best to leave resources for you. But first things first, your homework for this lesson is to create a list of 3 or 4 different characteristics that you want your language to include. And this can be cultural characteristics as well as things like sound, or if you want it to have certain word structures. Just a note. If you want to create something like what Tolkien created, understand this. Tolkien created his language long before he actually wrote the books. He was, by profession, a philologist, a word person, a linguist, whatever you want to call it. So he was very much creating a full language, and he wanted then to have a context in which the language was spoken, so he then wrote the books. Now, 99.99% of you are not going to need a full language like Tolkien. So you don't have to do everything here. You don't have to worry about sentence structure if you don't want to. If you don't want to worry about pragmatic use, although I would suggest it because the use of language is probably one of the more significant. Okay, anyways, I digress. But you don't have to create a fully fledged language. You don't even have to create a full vocabulary system if you don't want. Just create what you need. You can go as in-depth as you want in this process, but this should give you a place to start. Now, that is all I've got for this episode. Otherwise, I will leave all of the resources in the description box below. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, wherever. Send me a message. I'm more than happy to talk about language. I tend to get very keen on language. So yeah, that's all I've got for you today. I will see you next time. Next episode, we'll be dealing with phonetics. Oh boy. Cheers. Bye.